this to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Hey everybody, welcome back. I know it's been a little while since we've released some podcasts. It's been tough to record them as of late, but I promise you this one's going to be really good. I have with me, well, not technically with me, but on the phone with me, I have Professor Randy Barnett. He's a professor of legal theory at Georgetown University Law Center. He teaches constitutional law and contracts and is also the director of the Georgetown Center for the Constitution. Randy, thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, I'm really pleased we were able to make this work and look forward to this conversation a lot.
So we're going to talk about contracts mostly because that's my big area of interest. Okay, I'm just kidding. That would make my one good eye probably fall out.
I'll teach you what the bargain theory of consideration is and promissory estoppel, and everybody will come away very illuminated.
Oh boy. Wow. We might have to end the podcast right there. That was no, I want to really get your take on a whole variety of subjects. This is a really, frankly, a great time to have somebody of your stature on the show. You know, we're in the midst of mass protests. We're in the midst of conversations about policing. What is right? What is wrong? What is a proper use of a First Amendment? What isn't? And then the COVID-19 lockdowns. So there's just a lot to talk about here as it pertains to the Constitution, as it pertains to federalism, as it pertains to states' rights and the right of states to use their police power. So maybe let's start there. How is America doing right now? What's your general take on what we're seeing over the last week, and especially as it pertains to your area of expertise?
Well, first of all, I just start off by saying I think it's very disturbing, extremely disturbing, what we've just witnessed, what we've been going through the last couple of weeks. I should probably tell your audience a little bit about my background. I am now a professor of constitutional law at Georgetown. I have several books on the Constitution, on the original meaning of the Constitution, restoring the lost Constitution, on what the proper role of judges is in a constitutional republic, which is our Republican Constitution, and an introduction to constitutional law, 100 Supreme Court cases everyone should know. But before that, and before I was a contracts professor, I was a criminal prosecutor in Chicago for 4 years, and I went to law school to be a criminal lawyer. And by the time I was in law school, I decided I would rather do prosecution side than the defense side, although I was tempted by the defense side. And I was a Cook County state's attorney in Chicago, trying murders, rapes, armed robberies, spent a lot of time in police stations. One of the assignments I had as a prosecutor was felony review, which meant I spent 6 months full-time in police stations evaluating cases that the police would bring to us, assisting in investigations, interrogating suspects, interviewing witnesses. So that's my background in criminal justice. So I do have a background in criminal justice. And what we're going through now is very distressing, both from a constitutional standpoint and from a criminal justice standpoint. From a constitutional standpoint, the lockdown that we've been experiencing and continue to experience is distressing. And I think we should spend some time talking about why and how the situation has changed since February and March about that lockdown. And from a criminal justice standpoint, I think there's always been a lot of problems with law enforcement and organized police departments. But the solution to this is not to demonize the police to the point where they are at risk of physical harm to themselves, which is what we've been experiencing in the last couple of weeks with officers attacked and shot across the country that's not being reported. So this is very distressing. But I would have to say that's what's even more distressing. And maybe this is starting off at too deep a level, perhaps. But what's even more distressing is that we seem to be choosing up sides in this country now. And the issue isn't conservative versus liberal. The issue is conservative libertarians. I consider myself a libertarian versus the radical left. And the people that are in the middle of that are the liberals. And what's particularly distressing is that it's not the conservatives or libertarians that can necessarily defeat the radical left, in particular the Democratic Party, but it's got to be the liberals who do that. And I think the liberals are being absolutely run over in the Democratic coalition by the left wing of that coalition. And the New York Times thing that's happened recently is a good example of that. And that's distressing. It's distressing, the radicalization of the Democratic Party, as evidenced by mass protests and street violence, is distressing, because it means a breakdown of the kind of civil discourse that one used to be able to have between left and right, between conservative and liberal, between libertarian and conservative. I fear that ability to actually have a constructive dialogue, policy-wise and constitutionally, is very much under threat.
Yeah, and this is something I've long said. This is a broader topic. It doesn't even necessarily pertain to this week's issues. I mean, it does, but I mean it more broadly. This was always predictable to me that liberalism would always leads to an extremer form, whether it's Marxism or socialism, and that's because liberalism by its nature has no limiting principles. Progressivism is progress towards some end. It's an ever-changing end, and so it has to end up in an extreme place. It has to. It is built into the philosophy itself. So I'm not surprised at all. And they have no way to fight the radical left because they have no governing principles. They have no limiting principles with which to fight them. There is no framework that they can say, hey, get back in this box, because they never had one to begin with. That's my take on this. And so it's wholly predictable.
I'm not in a position to strongly disagree with you. I suppose I would like to have thought, given my lifetime of being in political discourse with people, so, I'm 68 years old. So, I was born in 1952. I've lived through the 60s. I lived through the riots. I lived through the assassinations, et cetera, et cetera. Your audience might be interested to know that when I was 12 years old, I debated on behalf of Barry Goldwater in front of my junior high school class, the entire student body.
Wow. Started young.
I go way back. But I would like to have thought there were at least two things that motivated, that we'll call liberals today, but really what we both mean, I think, are progressives. And what was motivating, two things that they were committed to, which was free speech and expression. That was something that they were very proud about, which would allow the hearing of alternative views, which is something that they still give lip service to, and the rule of law, that like cases need to be treated alike, and that people needed to basically obey a law so long as the legal system that was making it was fundamentally just or just enough. And I think the radical left has been attacking those two concepts in academia, and I am an academic, and I've been an academic since 1982. They've been attacking those two concepts since the 1980s, since the rise of the critical legal studies movement that then morphed into the radical feminism and critical race theory movements, and the rise of the hate crimes movement that came about in the 90s, where there's this, hate speech movement, which came about in the 90s as an innovation in free speech ideas or concepts. They've been attacking both pillars of liberalism intellectually, and they're not really, when they did that intellectually in law schools, they were not attacking me. They were not attacking conservatives or libertarians. We were not around very much to be attacked in academia. They were attacking the people they called liberals. That's who their enemy was, and that's who they called. And liberals pushed back. I mean, there was a fight back in the 80s and the 90s. But I think what's happened is they've been overwhelmed for a variety of reasons. And some of the old liberals, like my former professor, Alan Dershowitz, he's a good example of what liberals used to be like. But they're not like that anymore, and he's like 80 years old.
Yeah, and that's a fair point. And, I just don't know these liberals. I mean, I know Alan Dershowitz. I know some others, but they don't look anything to me like what I see in in the Democrat Party. So I they don't use the same language. There's almost like a ritualistic repeating of mantras in modern day liberalism. And I think what you're describing, what I would agree with, is a classical liberal who possibly disagrees with me on how much government should be involved in solving problems. Maybe we disagree on some social issues, maybe not. It depends. But but those basic principles are like a thing of the past, and it really is a shame.
I think they were a distinctive group. They were not classical liberal. I mean, I reserve the term classical liberals to libertarians and free market conservative types who believe in private property and markets and that sort of thing. A classical liberal is a perfectly good term. I would use that to distinguish us from those people who called themselves liberals, now call themselves progressives. But they did have some principles at their core. What I just mentioned, free speech, and the rule of law.
Yeah, they're just American principles.
And those two, yes, and they were American. They were pro-American liberals.
Yeah, but there was nobody disagreeing with those principles. Not even conservatives would disagree with those principles, and so we all. I guess I think we're agreeing. We were all we call ourselves a liberal democracy, of course, and that pertains to all conservatives, all liberals. It's just that these definitions get slippery, and then we have to. But it's important to define them.
Right. But the only reason I'm getting into this early in the podcast is because we started off by talking about what we've been experiencing for the last 2 weeks.
Right.
And I think what you've experienced for the last 2 weeks in the streets of major cities in this country is, and on the media, and I think most importantly on the media that has covered the events, is a collapse of liberals, the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. Under modern terms, that's what we've seen. My point is that their principles, they themselves individually and their principles have been under sustained intellectual attack for 40 years. And their attackers now hold the upper hand in academia. They obviously hold the upper hand at the New York Times because a liberal editor has just forced out in favor because of what the news side reporters wanted to have happen. This is what's really disturbing, Dan. This is really disturbing.
That is.
This means this is like the Israelis having to negotiate with the Palestinians. Obviously, you need to negotiate with people who are reasonable and are willing to negotiate with you, and not people who seek your destruction.
Yeah.
And so there's always the search of the moderate Palestinian that the Israelis could have a peace conference with, right? Have a peace talk with, and you find that they're murdered and they can't. Well, that's what's happening. It's going to be harder and harder for folks like you and me to have a constructive dialogue with people to our left. When the Democratic Party, one of the two major parties in this country, is being dominated, and the intellectual and the media that basically is their wing of their party is being dominated by the left, the radical left, the cultural left, and not liberals anymore. That is what's so disturbing.
Yeah, I want to get to this a little later, but what I was thinking as you're talking is, how do you talk like this and remain in academia at Georgetown? So I guess there's still some hope if you're even allowed to have a job. But I think the problem is that you're alluding to is I don't think Democrats, good-natured liberal Democrats that really don't believe a lot of the things that are being spewed by the media and by progressives, they simply don't believe that their party has embraced it. And just being in politics, I noticed this quite a bit. If I'm speaking with anybody, or say a constituent, or I see comments online, and I'm pointing out what's going on. I'm pointing out, and I'm just quoting. And I never quote fringe Twitter users, okay? I only quote mainstream journalists and politicians. And so, because I think that's fair, all right? If you're going to say this is what the left is saying, I think you should quote their leaders and what is happening mainstream. Don't quote their fringe. They love to do that to the right. They're always quoting our craziest people and saying, see what they think. And you're like, right. Okay, come on, guys. That's not a fair debate here. So I always do that. But I'll see the comment sections, and I'll be accused of of building a straw man argument or gaslighting or whatever phrase they want to use. But it's like, so are you saying, and I want to ask, like, are you saying we agree? Are you saying you agree that that's a bad thing, but you just think I'm being disingenuous with my argument? But I don't think I am, because this is the direction. So my point is that the reason they've been so blindsided by it, let's say good-natured liberals have been so blindsided by the progressives, is that they're in complete denial, and I think remain in complete denial. And I think that they will pander to the progressives as long as it takes, just to maintain that sort of that unity. Wearing the blue jersey, you've got to keep the blue jersey on and maintain that unity, because in the end they still don't like the conservatives the most, right? And Donald Trump just represents everything that's evil to them. And so, I think that's the unfortunate reality of where we stand with respect to this.
Well, it's a well-known phenomenon amongst liberals, modern liberals, who I call progressives, and I reserve the word leftist for the left, to the left of the progressives. But it's a long-standing characteristic of them, dating back to the 1950s, and that is the no enemies to their left position.
Yeah.
So,
and that's a problem.
They always make common cause with people to their left on the theory that they all share the same ends, and what they disagree about is the means and the tactics.
Yeah.
But they basically share the ends with people to their left. So they have no enemies to the left. They may be mildly critical of means, but they reserve, because the true enemy is to their right.
Yeah.
So there's no real possibility of a coalition to your right, because that's where the enemy lies. All the coalition building is done to the left. And then what's happened is they are being eaten by their coalition partners. That's what's happening.
And going back to my first statement, I think this is the problem, is they say they agree on the ends, but they've never defined the ends. See, as a conservative, we can basically say what we mean by the ends, because there's limiting principles. I mean, our governing philosophy is in a box, and it's framed by the Constitution. It's framed by the Declaration of Independence. You can't go much further outside of that. And I think actually conservatives have been pretty good about excluding people outside of those parameters from our own movement, whereas the left doesn't. And the reason is because you can't define what the ends are there. Because a few years ago it was closed borders. Now it's open borders. It wasn't Medicare for all a decade ago. Now it's changed, and the reason it has to change is because, progressivism. You always have to build upon what you had last time, because if your entire philosophy is about promising people more things in order to gain power. See, I think power is the end. That's the problem. And so to gain power, you got to build a coalition, and to build a coalition, they think you have to promise people things and services and promise to end their suffering. And it's easy politically to do that, but it's also not honest. And I think it ends up, I think it naturally ends up in this extreme state that we're talking about. You mentioned the op-ed. We should probably say what you were talking about real quick. So. I think, although most listeners probably already know, the New York Times published Tom Cotton's op-ed, which he basically argues for. I don't think he even goes as far as to say that we should call in the Insurrection Act right now. Maybe he just says that it should definitely be an option. I may be right or wrong about that. In either case, he's bringing up the Insurrection Act to quell the mass rioting, widespread rioting that we've seen throughout the country. And he was taken to task for it. So what did you think about his argument just on its face?
I actually, haven't spent as much time on that as I should because basically, if you're a common law professor and you're in social media, basically there's a new constitutional law subject matter every day. It's sort of like they set out in the morning, and now today we have to know about what's an impeachable offense, and the next day we have to know about I can't even remember the statutes we had to know last week. There was all these different statutes you have to know. Now it's the Insurrection Act. And honestly, I view myself as an academic. I do not as a scholar. I do not view myself as an activist. I'm not a talking head. I'm not an opinion person. I'm not a pundit. So I reserve comment to things that I know something about. And in my summer times, and I just finished my semester of research leave, I'm writing a book on the original meaning of the 14th Amendment, which talks about the operative clauses of the Section 1 of the 14th Amendment and Section 5, which empowers Congress to enforce it. That's what I've been spending my time on. That's my level of expertise. So I know I have this moral duty to get up to speed on the Insurrection Act, but I basically let other people get there before me. Then I try to hear what they have to say and figure out who makes the most sense. It sounds to me, from what I'm reading, as an educated consumer of other people's opinions, that the Insurrection Act has been invoked numerous times to give federal control over state militias, or over the militias, or the National Guard, I should say, that exist state by state. And this has happened numerous times to quell civil disobedience, civil disorder, not civil disobedience, civil disorder, including, George H.W. Bush and others who have done this. And so this really should not have been anything that it signaled any kind of authoritarianism. The only question is it justified based on the facts on the grounds as a policy matter? Is this something that's actually going to make the situation better or worse? That should be the question, not whether invoking this 200-year-old act that's been invoked numerous times puts us on a stepping stone or on the doorstep of authoritarian fascism.
Yeah, I think it's almost reactionary for the left to call anything that a Republican does as authoritarian or fascist. These are not well thought out terms that I think being used, but they use them anyway. So I guess another way to ask this question.
And I will say that one other thing I will just say is that we have a history in this country of having to protect individual citizens and their property from mobs, as well as from local mayors and governors who refuse to do that job. And we had a 100-year experience of Jim Crow laws, in which the Republican Congress had to pass numerous enforcement acts to give federal authorities the power to go in and suppress mob violence against African Americans and white Republicans in the South, and who were being massacred, literally massacred by mobs, aided and abetted by local law enforcement. And local law enforcement wouldn't do the job. And the whole 14th Amendment came about because this was happening after the passage of the 13th Amendment. That's why we have a 14th Amendment. That's why Congress has the powers it has under Section 5. This actually relates to my book. Yeah, that's what it's for. Now, what we have in this country, the last 2 weeks, is we've had Democratic governors, largely, not exclusively, and Democratic mayors of major cities, because most major cities have been under Democratic control for a long time, either fecklessly or just refusing to suppress mob violence against innocent people and their property, including shop owners and stuff, which has cost the inner cities and other minority neighborhoods their livelihoods, their places where they shop, the access to pharmaceuticals. This is all being done. This is all being allowed to happen. This is not the same thing as peaceful protests. We actually saw peaceful protests over the weekend in D.C. You can have mass peaceful protests, but those are not peaceful protests. Those were riots. Those were looting. Those were mobs. And the idea that that ultimately the President of the United States, using authority that's been given to him by Congress, can step in with National Guard troops or even federal troops to suppress an insurrection, to suppress domestic violence, is not something unprecedented in this country. It's one of the reasons we have a federal government. It's certainly one of the reasons we have the 14th Amendment.
Right. So it's a policy question. It's not a constitutional question. The Constitution is pretty clear on it. If the state is not protecting life, liberty, and property. The 14th Amendment says, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, and property without due process of law. But I guess as a constitutional law person, would deprive any person of the equal protection of the laws.
And the core meaning of the equal protection of the laws was the duty of government to protect your civil rights, and your civil rights included both your rights to your personal integrity as well as your property rights. Those were all part of your civil rights. That is an affirmative. See, conservatives have read the 14th Amendment wrong for a long time. Back to since the 1880s. They've read the 14th Amendment as limited to state action, but it's not limited to state action. States are not, it's limited. It also includes state inaction.
Right.
And the Equal Protection Clause creates an affirmative, positive duty on the part of state governments to protect us in our civil rights. Now, what can be done if they fail to do so? Well, under certain circumstances, courts can act. But generally speaking, the courts are not in a position to mandate that local governments protect our civil liberties. What what the 14th Amendment did is they added Section 5, which empowered Congress to enforce Section 1, the Equal Protection Clause. And that meant Congress could step in and authorize the executive branch to provide the protection of the laws when local governments could not. That's one of the principal reasons why we have a 14th Amendment in the Constitution.
Right. Yeah, and it is very clear. So it really isn't a constitutional argument at all. I think that is rather clear. And in the Declaration of Independence.
I want to say, Dan, this is an argument that academic conservatives and activist conservatives who care very much about the Constitution do not understand. They do not realize this is the history of the 14th Amendment. They've accepted a post-New Deal interpretation of the 14th Amendment that actually is way pre-New Deal, because the Supreme Court started gutting the 14th Amendment in the 1870s and 1880s and limiting it to state action. And they've accepted this. Political conservatives have accepted this, including conservative law professors. And the courts have accepted this. And conservative judges have accepted this. So it's really important to understand that that's not what the original meaning of the 14th Amendment was.
Right.
And it's the reason why the federal government does have the power. And the president has that power when authorized by law.
And so why have they accepted it, and what issues has it affected? Have they accepted it because there's such a fear of what might happen when progressives take over?
I don't think so. It's a very long span. It'd be hard to completely unpack in this podcast, I think, because it's a very long-standing thing. It starts with a pushback against the 14th Amendment that comes from Republicans. The Democrats hated the 14th Amendment. They all opposed the 14th Amendment. They were the enemy of the 14th Amendment. Mm-hmm. So you just take Democrats out of the equation. But what ultimately happened was, after the Civil War started going into the rearview mirror, and Reconstruction started going on longer and longer, like the occupation or like the American presence in Iraq, long after the war is won, you're still there, and now you're fighting a Sunni insurgency. This is what the American Army was fighting in the South. They won the war, and then they were fighting a Confederate insurgency. And eventually the public, like the public in the United States with respect to Iraq, the public in the United States with respect to the South got tired of this. And they wanted to pull back. And there were a lot of Republican jurists and professors and other people who actually thought that the 14th Amendment threatened federalism, that the 14th Amendment was a radical amendment put in by radicals to address a problem, but it's time for cooler heads to prevail and restore our federalism, where states have a lot more authority, that the 14th Amendment was going to qualify. So there was this pullback against the 14th Amendment in the 1870s, starts in 1873 with the slaughterhouse cases, goes into the 1880s. And by the time modern conservatives were born and got their legal education, this was all well accepted by the Supreme Court. It's been well over 100 years that this vision of the 14th Amendment has dominated. Now, there's been pushback from the left, from the left side of academia. I don't mean the radical left. I mean from people who are progressives, who have sort of semi-rediscovered the original meaning of the 14th Amendment. But there are real issues with what you do about that. What do you? So I will say, in direct answer to your question, Dan, there are real practical problems, real serious practical problems with trying to effectuate the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause in the way it's meant to be effectuated, because it does create the risk of federal judges, for example, interfering with state governments to an untoward or undue degree. So This is it's a very complicated subject. But I think constitutional conservatives need to start with the original meaning first, and not let their concern about consequences undermine how they read the amendment. First, get the amendment's meaning right, and then we'll worry about what's the most practical way to implement it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we have time to talk about activist judges here in a little bit, because it does seem to me like certain decisions made in certain courts have these sweeping effects across the country that were just is not how a republic should be governed at all. But with regards to the 14th Amendment, and sticking to that conversation real quick, there's when you say that the goal of the 14th Amendment is to protect life, liberty, property, and this really directly relates to the lockdowns and the debate there. I mean, I think I would say that that it is unconstitutional to implement the lockdowns the way that they did. They would argue, maybe the left would argue, and many of these Democrat governors that were highly in favor of lockdowns and continued lockdowns would say they do have the power, they have the responsibility to force safety. So what's the right reading of the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, with respect to lockdowns?
This is very nuanced. I mean, I'm not going to say complex. I'm just going to say nuanced, because it's not an on-off switch. It's constitutional. It's not constitutional. I think what the Due Process Clause requires, now I'm switching to the Due Process Clause, is a judicial inquiry into whether governmental efforts to regulate our liberty are reasonable or are they arbitrary? Because government judges ought to be giving a lot of leeway to the other branches to regulate liberty in order to protect the rights of all of us, because that's what the legislative branches are supposed to be doing. And then the executive branches, the governors, are supposed to be doing what their legislatures tell them to do. They should be accountable to the legislatures of their states. So I think judges, state judges and federal judges need to give a lot of leeway, but that doesn't mean unlimited plenary power. And that's basically the position that both conservatives and progressives have arrived at for the last 50 or 60 years, and that is that the police power of states is effectively unlimited, or more accurately, limited only by an enumerated right, a right to be found in the first 8 amendments of the Constitution, like freedom of speech, press assembly, free exercise of religion. If you don't have an enumerated right, legislatures can do what they want. That, I think, is wrong. I think you give leeway to legislatures to be acting in good faith, but what good faith means is they must be actually making reasoned judgments about a genuine threat to our rights. Now, with that as a background, what do you do about a pandemic or an epidemic that you're threatened with? Now, back in February or January, when the Democrats were busy impeaching President Trump, what were we facing? Did there exist a health potential threat to the public health in the form of the Wuhan virus or the COVID-19 virus? Did they actually face that? And I think we had evidence of our senses that yes, in Wuhan they had a big problem. In Italy they had a big problem. This virus creates problems that ordinary flu viruses do not create, or at least we don't know. So at that point, was it reasonable, given our state of knowledge, which was very thin, but this was not an imaginary threat. This was not something made up. We could look at other countries. We could see people are dying and think intense measures are being taken. Does government have a responsibility to protect the rights of all of us and our public health by taking measures to combat that? And I would say yes. In the face of that knowledge, they had that power, and the judiciary would essentially say, given the state of knowledge we have, yes, you can take certain measures. But here's the thing. This is why it's not on or off. As we get more information, as we learn more, as we have experience, the constitutionality of these measures will be affected by that. Because what was reasonable when you only knew very little might become unreasonable when you know more. And once you see these laws being applied, or these policies being applied in an arbitrary fashion, so you can get together on the streets and you can do this, but you can't get together on the streets and do that. And you go into a store, you can buy this, but you can't go into a store to buy that. Once you see these things administered in an arbitrary fashion, that's unconstitutional. It's a sign that this is not being based on reasoned judgment. So I'm trying to identify here a middle ground between the government can't protect us in our health and safety, which I think is not consistent with the 14th Amendment. I don't think that nor that the government can do whatever it damn well pleases unless it's violating an enumerated right. I don't think that's right either. So I'm trying to identify a middle ground, and that's a hard ground to occupy. As you know, when you're in the middle, you get attacked from both sides.
Yeah, but it seems about right, and people have a natural sense of what is right and wrong. I think that's why you saw protests against the lockdowns, because people see the arbitrary nature of some of these rules. And I think there's also this sense that you can't make something illegal when it was perfectly legal and encouraged 5 minutes ago, and all of a sudden you get a fine for doing it. I think that
Right.
feels wrong, and people don't always have the easiest time putting that into words, why it feels wrong, but it does feel wrong. I mean, our laws are basically based on, just in a general sense, I think law is based on a sense of morality and ethics that is thousands and thousands of years in the making. And it's deeply imbued in us. We don't always know how to describe it in a really rational way, but it's there. And we sense it when it's off. And you see the backlash that you saw, and you see sort of authoritarian, or I think simple-minded, unthinking authoritarians is maybe the best way I would describe them. To try to take advantage of that and really for political purposes. They just want to say that they're taking action, because taking action these days is like the highest virtue, which is nonsense. It's not, but that's how too many politicians feel, and it's unfortunately what too many people cry out for. And then the other. Go ahead.
Could I just interject? This connects up with what you earlier said that I didn't actually respond to, but I think it connects to what you earlier said, that ultimately what's motivating people to the left of us, not necessarily on the hard left, but is a desire for a certain kind of power. That's what you said before.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the pandemic or an epidemic of this kind, when there is a police power that does in fact exist to protect public health and safety, it is a thing, it's a real thing. It presents a tremendous opportunity to exercise power. And if your ultimate visceral end is to legitimate power whenever you can, by whatever justification is ready at hand, this provided a very, very good one. And so the exercise of power becomes, for some people, an end in itself, is what you said before. And I think that might be why you actually see a disparate response by Republican governors than Democratic governors. Now, we have Republican governors like Larry Hogan, who is acting very much like the Democratic governors did. So it's not like this is, you can just categorize everybody in one basket or the other. But why I think you have a tendency on the part of a governor like the governor of Michigan to really, really want to exercise power. This gives a good excuse to do so, and it doesn't really matter whether it's mask on or mask off. It's just as long as it's one or the other, they can make you do it. Mask on or mask off, they're equally happy, because the principle here is the exercise of power over the individual.
Yeah, I think that's been very clear. But it gets to another question too, which is, what is the purpose of law, and don't you have to think a little, I would say, clearer and I think a little harder at least about how you enforce that law, and whether it's just a guideline, and if it's about personal risk, that personal risk occurs from voluntary interactions, then is it really the place of government to be taking such a heavy hand in preventing that risk? And that's the question I asked quite a bit, and I don't think most leaders even got to that question, right? It's all about action.
When you step outside your door, you're incurring risk. When you get behind the wheel of a car, you're incurring risk. When you get into a car that someone else is operating, you incur risk. When you walk down, when you choose to ride your bicycle on a street, especially with moving cars close by you, you're incurring risk. And the way that we in basically Western countries handle this is that we say that other people, you're incurring the risk of other people acting non-negligently. This is what's handled by tort law.
Mm-hmm.
So you go out there, and if somebody happens to non-negligently hurt you, that's a risk you've incurred when you walk out the door. What you haven't incurred the risk of is somebody acting negligently,
right,
or willfully, or wantonly, or recklessly, or intentionally. All of those risks you have not incurred when you walk out the door. That's the judgment we've made. But we do not live in a risk-free world. You never will, because the world is full of risks. And we don't live in a risk-free legal environment either. So it doesn't. It's hard to immediately translate negligence over to communicable diseases.
Yeah.
Communicating a disease without knowing they got it. That's the problem. But by and large, The very fact that something is risky is not enough to prohibit it. That's not ever been
And I would yeah, exactly. And people try to use the analogy to driving quite a bit, and it's a somewhat fair analogy, but I'm not quite sure it stacks up. And the reason being this: driving exclusively occurs on public roadways that are shared by everyone. So there is an obvious role for government to regulate how we use those roadways. You have to wear a seatbelt and use turn signals and stop at stop signs and things like that. And that isn't how the virus really works. Obviously, it's not going to get transmitted. Really, I'm not even sure what public spaces it might get transmitted in. Maybe a library. So,
right.
Okay, so I'm sure the government has every right to close down that library then. Maybe it seems obvious that mass gatherings should be limited. But to close down businesses seems I don't think the analogy works anymore, because it's a private business and everybody working and using that business and patroning that business is totally voluntary. So I don't think the analogy works. I mean, that's my legal analysis from the half credit I took at Harvard Law once. So does that work though?
Look, I think where arbitrariness first started being introduced into this regime of regulation is when the distinction was made between essential and non-essential businesses.
Yeah. That felt inherently unfair, and people realized it quickly.
Because it's up to the government, apparently. It's up to the government to designate essential from unessential. And there wasn't a clear criteria by which something would be essential or what would not. I mean, alcohol sales were deemed essential. Gun sales in some jurisdictions were deemed non-essential. And they love to lampoon people who want to get haircuts or other kinds of personal grooming. That's obviously non-essential as far as they're concerned. But the ability to administer fairly the distinction between essential and non-essential is something that I think cannot be done. And that is where that's where we first saw arbitrariness creep into this early regime of public health response. The other thing I think we need to mention, and I know you know this, and that is that things shut down. People withdrew long before weeks before there was a lockdown. I pulled my 91-year-old mother and my 97-year-old father-in-law out of their senior apartment building in Chevy Chase and brought them down to Central Virginia on March 16th. Because
Right.
It became apparent that stuff was happening, and I was concerned about their well-being in that building, which has not had any problems, but they locked that building down and they closed the restaurant, and everybody's now confined to their apartments, and it's fed it's like being in prison there. So I did this not because any government agency told me to, because I was listening to both. I was listening to public authorities. I was also listening to my niece, who's a pulmonary physician in New York. So I had people listen to. I think a lot of this stuff, businesses were already losing patronage because of private action. But one more thing about the experts, because I think that's something that you might want to get into as well.
Mm-hmm.
I ordered surgical masks in mid-February. I go back to my Amazon account to can tell you the exact date I ordered them. And I was immediately told by the time they arrived by experts in the media that masks were of no value whatsoever, and you shouldn't wear them, and they really are pointless. And when I went in by March, when it came time to move to Central Virginia, I almost left the masks behind because I was listening as best I could to the experts and what they were telling me. I took them with me, thank goodness, and I had my nephew got me some N95 masks as well to wear, which is what my wife and I basically wear when we go shopping. But I tried to listen to the experts, and they change their mind, and they keep changing their minds every few weeks. Now, it's very hard for people who want to regulate their behavior in a responsible manner to know what's responsible when they can't trust the opinions of the people who are telling them what's responsible.
There's been a number of thought experiments that I would throw out there for people to just show that the obsession with some of this supposed expertise is highly misguided. Namely the curve and the peak, right? We hear these constantly: flatten the curve and pay attention to the peak. When we're 2 weeks past the peak, then we can open up again. And I'm like, there isn't a good logical sequence to come to that conclusion that makes any sense. Mostly because they never talk about the absolute value under the curve. And I think that matters quite a bit. I mean, I think even CDC guidelines were misguided because what did the CDC guidelines say? You know, to move into the next phase, you have to have a decrease in cases for 14 days straight. Well, okay. Well, what if you're stuck at about 100 cases per day, which is generally what Houston deals with, for instance, and has dealt with consistently. But in New York, you have, I don't know, 20,000 cases a day. And so it goes down to 6,000 cases a day, which is still huge, but they can reopen and Houston can't. That doesn't make any sense just on its face. Like there's a lot of other factors that need to be taken into account, but our supposed experts would just oversimplify this to an extraordinary degree. Now, luckily, most governors didn't listen to that guidance. Most governors, I know a Texas governor in particular, I can speak for because he said this, is, you know, he's looking at a couple different numbers, and one of them is hospitalization rates. That's the right number. Remember, that was the whole purpose of lockdowns. You know, if you're going to make a solid case for protecting life, liberty, and property, yeah, you don't want your hospitals to be overwhelmed. You know, and I think we were all in favor of that. But once the data came out, and once you see hospitals not getting overwhelmed, it's an indication that you're over locking down, and that it needs to rebalance.
So can we go back to the Constitution for a minute? So let's tie this back into the Constitution, which is what you're having me on to talk about. So all this suggests that what's constitutional when it comes to the exercise of states' police power to protect public health and safety, which it has, what's constitutional is when that power is being exercised reasonably. Now, reasonably means it needs to be data-driven, supported by facts, and you evaluate policies to see if they're arbitrary. What you just told me was a story of arbitrariness. It's arbitrary to say we picked this number because look at what it means if you pick that number and apply it to New York versus what you get if you apply it to Houston. That ends up being arbitrary in the sense that it cannot be rationally justified. So something that is okay in the beginning can become unconstitutional as we go out. And this is something that judges ought to, at some point, it's okay for them to step in and put government to the test, to have them justify what they're doing as not arbitrary and say, okay, you tell me, this is your policy, this is what's under challenge now, you tell me why it has to be this way, and we'll let both sides hash it out, and I'm going to decide who has the better argument for two sides in front of me.
So here's kind of a, maybe seems like a simpleton question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What part of the Constitution are you referencing when you say that it's unconstitutional to have a law that is arbitrary, not based in data, not based in sound reason? You know, because aren't all of those things subjective? You can interpret data any way you want. You can reason any way you want, even if it's crazy. And so how do you reference the Constitution when making that argument?
This is a product of the due process of law. This comes under the rubric of the due process of law. And we have two due process clauses in the Constitution, one that applies to the federal government, the Fifth Amendment, and one that applies to the state governments, it's in the 14th Amendment. So all government, before a government can deprive any person of life, and liberty by imprisonment, or property by a fine, must do so. Before you can be deprived of those things, you're entitled to the process, a judicial process, because the due process of law is about judicial process. Mm-hmm. You're entitled to a judicial process that establishes at least two different things. You can question two different things. One is, are you actually guilty of violating an order that you're given by the government? So are you commit the murder? Judicial process to assess whether you're liable or not liable. And secondly, it's the due process of law. You're entitled to challenge whether the law that's being applied to you is arbitrary or not.
Yeah.
Before we get to arbitrary, there's an intermediate step. You're entitled to challenge whether the law that's being applied to you is within the proper power of a legislature to enact.
Yeah.
And at the federal level, we say, is it within one of the enumerated powers of Congress? At the state level, we say, is it within the Congress's the state's police power? That's their residual power to protect our individual rights. And it is not it is not a proper exercise of either an enumerated power or police power to exercise those powers arbitrarily. And this is a standard of arbitrariness that goes all the way back to Magna Carta. Arbitrary is a word that we know is a bad thing, but what does it really mean? Arbitrary means you're doing something solely because another person wills it or desires you to do it, and not because of a reason that's independent of somebody's will. That's what arbitrary has historically meant, dating back to Magna Carta. So with respect to Magna Carta, it was unlawful for the king, for the monarch, to deprive anybody of life, liberty, or property except by a law of the land and a judgment of their peers. The mere fact that the king willed it was not a good enough reason. The mere fact that a governor wills it is not a good reason. They have to have a good reason. And at some point, after you give due deference to other branches, at some point, the individual citizen who is the ultimate sovereign of this country has the opportunity to go into court before they're deprived of life, liberty, or property and say, look, there is not a good reason for this. This isn't even being done because of a good reason. It's being done because of the will of the sovereign, and that's not good enough. Let the sovereign come in and explain why they're doing it, and let that excuse stand the test of critical scrutiny.
Okay.
The way I think you were arguing that the 2 weeks of decline of cases did not stand rational scrutiny. You just explained how that did not withstand rational scrutiny.
Yeah, you know what's scary though is our definition of what's rational, and I think long held standards of logical thinking and logical sequencing. What constitutes a logical fallacy and what doesn't? Those are all being turned on their head. I mean, it gets back to this same conversation of the liberals versus the far left, and fundamentally, it's turning rationality on its head, and overturning some very, very basic and long held, I think, traditions, beliefs, whatever you want to call them, and it's dangerous.
Postmodern. That's postmodernism. It does do that, but we've just seen that we've just seen immediate evidence of what I'm talking about when public health officials were saying that you couldn't have more than so many people in a restaurant, and you couldn't have a summer camp with more than so many people together. You couldn't have a funeral with more than so many people together. And then those same public health officials, many of them, sign a mass letter saying it was okay to be out in the street.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up. It's ridiculous.
That's arbitrary. It's arbitrary. That means it's the will. Everybody with common sense can look at that and see, and if they want to, if they're not on one side of this or the other, and they can say that it's the will of the public health expert that's being manifested here. That's what it is about. It's their will. It's not based on their reason. It's based on their will. And their will is they like this. They think this is important and essential.
Right.
And they think this other thing is not important and not essential. That is simply their will. And that is not an adequate basis on which to deprive any person of life, liberty, or property in this country under the 5th and 14th Amendments.
Do you see state and local leaders being brought to court for some of these actions that have been taken? As a practical matter, it's very, very difficult. Why? For the reasons I said, people were still tuning into this podcast back then. And that is that both left and many decades has bought into the idea that governments have unlimited or plenary powers under the police power unless an enumerated right is being threatened, like the free exercise of religion. Yeah. So the only challenges you see getting any traction are free exercise challenges because of that. Okay. Well, that's a start. There is no enumerated right to have a business. Right. It's a start. And it's important. But there is no enumerated right to operate a business. So when people were calling on the president to, reopen states, I mean, there was a lot of contradicting messaging on this, mostly from the media, who said that Trump should lock down everything, but then had no power to open up everything. So where do you, from a federalist standpoint, where do you stand on all that? I think not under modern constitutional law, but necessarily, but under the original meaning of the Constitution, this is the power to protect health and safety is primarily a state responsibility. It is not a federal responsibility. But I guess when federal responsibility,
the federal responsibility vis-a-vis the states, first of all, they have a responsibility about interstate commerce and commerce that takes place with other countries. But with respect to the states, their responsibility is to ensure that states do not deprive people of equal protection of the laws or due process of the laws, which is what's happened in the last 2 weeks. The feds have a responsibility for that. They do not have a general responsibility for public health. That, under our system, for better or for worse, is the responsibility of our 50 states.
Yeah, so I mean, more specifically, and I fully agree with that. My position all along has been President Trump never had the power to lock down the entire country, nor does he really have the power to open it back up. But there's a but here now. Now there's a but here if states are implementing irrational and arbitrary infringements on people's freedom, which I think you and I agree that they have. And so you do think there would be a case for federal involvement. If I think we're past that moment at this point, but there would have been a case.
I think that there can be. The Department of Justice was initially created in order to systematically address the failure of local governments to protect the people in their civil rights, as well as to act arbitrarily towards them. And so that's why we have a Department of Justice. Now, it has to be authorized by statute, and that's when we get into the myriad of federal statutes that might or might not authorize the Department of Justice to do this, that, or the other thing. But Congress has the power under Section 5 of the 14th Amendment to pass laws to protect individuals when their states fail to do so from their states themselves, or when the states fail to protect them from private parties.
I also want to go back to sort of the beginning of our conversation in this week's events, because you mentioned your experience in criminal law, and we talked about the role of federal government as it pertains to putting down riots and things like that, the responsibility of local authorities and states, but just in general, if you have any comments on how policing needs to improve. There's been a lot of talk about qualified immunity and the reform that might need. Do you have any thoughts on all that, given your experience?
Yeah, I think that generally speaking, qualified immunity of local government officials is a bad idea. It's a judge-created idea. There's nothing in the Constitution about it. There isn't even much in statutory law about it. It's something that judges have created. And have had an effect for a very long time. It's been something that has been shared by what you'd call, conservative and liberal judges. They've all sort of agreed about this, and I think it's a problem. But you and I were talking about before the podcast. Qualified immunity, although I have some opinions about it, is not an area that I study deeply, and therefore I do not consider myself an expert on the ins and outs of and the pros and cons of it, which is something I think you kind of need to talk to somebody who has thought about that issue a lot more deeply than I have. I'm skeptical of it. I think it's a bad idea. But exactly what should replace it and how far we should go, I think it's somebody who's thought about it more.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. On its face, you see some of the issues against it, and it does seem a little bit irrational that there would be an immunity. I think in practice, many police would argue that it in practice, the courts actually, I think, judge rather well and appropriately on when police should be held liable and when they shouldn't. But what are the rooms for reform? And we're going to have those conversations, I think, in Congress, and so we'll be looking. We need to get it right, I think, because it can go very wrong where police feel like they have no recourse whatsoever, no protection whatsoever, and then they just don't enforce the law. And we have seen crime go way up in a lot of major cities in the last few years, and I really hope that doesn't continue to be the case. But when you're talking about defunding the police, that seems almost guaranteed to be the case. And I'm very worried about that. And I guess in your time, you said you worked in Chicago in criminal law. I mean, was there the widespread problems that are being talked about? Did you see those in person? Are they as how long ago was this? And have they been reformed since then? I mean, are there other reforms you would suggest?
I think so much better than they used to be. They were already getting better by the time I was a prosecutor. I started as a prosecutor in 1977. I left in 1981, so you get some idea of the time frame we're talking about. The Warren Court had already done most of its criminal procedure things, which I think were really important to help to get cops to clean up their act. They weren't going to do it on their own. So some judicial intervention was necessary, and I also think justified constitutionally as well. And things were already getting better, but they had a long way to go. And I think things have continued to get better. You see, for example, the composition of police forces now are much, much more racially diverse and ethnically diverse than they were even back in the 70s and the 80s. Major metropolitan police departments have been thoroughly integrated. And, one of the images we saw in the last couple of weeks are white radical lefty Antifas getting into the face of African-American police officers who are standing there stoically being told how racist they are. That is sort of the problem. So things are better, much, much better, but that doesn't mean things are perfect. But here's the thing, Dan, and I think this is important to say. I don't necessarily think that the people who are engaged in the most extreme tactics in the street really care very much about this issue. Yeah. They are using an issue that other people care about, other reasonable people care about, that all people care about, in order to advance their radical agenda, which would include, for example, eliminating all law enforcement would be something that they would, that would be on their radar. That's not on the radar of people who want better police protection. They don't want no police protection. They want better police protection. But people are using that issue that everybody cares about in order to advance an agenda, and they're not interested in policy improvements. They're not interested in hearing about, well, we can do this, but we can't do that. That's not what they want to talk about, because that's not why they're exploiting this issue. They're exploiting this issue for their own radical political ends.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I've seen very few reasonable policy suggestions, which does indicate that it's about something else. And and you can't
defend yourself. There's actually no use getting into a conversation these days by postulating policy responses, because then you're going to be told, well, you just basically missed the point. You just don't get it.
Yeah.
Don't bother me with these things.
Right. Yeah. You can't ask too many questions. That's exactly right. It becomes a circular conversation rather quickly. And so, I want to shift topics again. I just wanted to. We didn't dive into that very much, and given your experience, I just wanted to give you the opportunity to give us your insights on that. Now I want to shift back to some other things we've talked about, which is, what it's like on college.
Can I say one more thing?
Sure. Yeah. Before we move on, yeah.
Because I work with cops a lot, and I genuinely like them, but of course I saw cops of all kinds. So good cops, bad cops, lazy cops were the biggest problem. Cops that just weren't interested in doing very much. Mm-hmm. But if I'm confronted by a cop on the street, man, oh man. I mean, and this was true even when I was a prosecutor and I had an ID and I didn't have a badge. They didn't give us badges, but I had an ID. And I knew that ultimately, because I was a prosecutor, nothing bad was going to happen to me. But even under those circumstances, I would not challenge a cop's authority on the street, because that would be an invitation for them to do something bad to me. That is, if you want a cop to do something, just tell them they can't do that, and then they'll do it. So I'm not saying this reflects well on cops. I'm just saying this is the psychology of cops, of many, many cops, who have to they're kind of out there on an island with all kinds of threats around them, and then they adopt this mentality because of the position I think they're being placed in. Some of it goes to their head, and even the cops that doesn't go to their head, they're in this situation. And then the problem is that when you challenge them, as I would never do as a white person, I would not challenge the cops when they stop me, because I just think that would be a recipe for trouble on my part. And I just think that is one of the problems that I don't know that there's any solution to. It's just a part of the psychology of being a police officer and doing the job that they're being asked to do.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sympathetic to it because I was a SEAL, so I understand what it's like to be in life-threatening situations all the time. I think they have a much more difficult job than I did, because there's so much more gray area being a police officer. You have to have that mental capacity to shift from totally different frames of mind very, very rapidly, and you do in the military too.
Yeah.
But the consequences aren't nearly as high for us. If we, and we also have a lot more training, but it's an extremely difficult job, and I think more journalists should have to do ride-alongs. I think they should have to go through scenarios that represent how difficult it is and how you have to make these quick life or death decisions. Now, none of that, of course, would excuse what happened to George Floyd. That was just that just looked like murder. And very obviously so, but also nobody disagrees with that. There's not a single police officer that disagrees with that. There was no gray area on the George Floyd case, and I think that's why it brought up so much anger, is because it's on video. You can see basically what is a murder taking place, and it makes people mad. But it also doesn't mean that police even come close to doing that on a regular basis, but that's the narrative that we're hearing right now, and it's not ultimately true.
I agree. They don't. I know that the police do not do that on a regular basis. However, before there were video cameras, when they did do it, and then they said they didn't do it, it was impossible to prove otherwise.
Yeah.
Without calling them a liar, which means they got away with it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I grew up, and to your point about being afraid of cops, and I hear that a lot. We shouldn't have to be afraid of police. Well, I was taught to be afraid of police. I've always been taught that. I don't know. I've always been taught that. Like, don't, just no matter what. Like, just don't. And I'm not sure there's another way to be.
I have my concealed carry weapon permit for DC. I qualified for it 4 years ago. I just went through the requalification instruction course as well. And one of the things that I did to prepare myself was I was started to watch some YouTube videos about how a concealed carry permit user should handle themselves if they're stopped for a traffic violation and they're armed. What do you do? Well, there's a series of procedures that are best practice for what you do. You roll down your window. You put your hands on the steering wheel. You show the officer, when he comes up to the car, you have the hands on the steering wheel, and you inform them that you are a concealed carry permit user, and you are currently armed, and what do you want me to do?
Yeah, seems pretty straightforward.
Seems pretty straightforward. Your hands
yeah.
on the steering wheel. Now, that is a submissive position to be in. You are putting yourself in you're putting yourself in a submissive position, but what you're doing is you're anticipating a possibly irrational and fearful response by a police officer to an armed civilian. And you want to reduce the risk, you want to reduce the threat to the officer so the officer doesn't act somewhat in a hostile way towards you. And so you take this proactive step. Now, that's not because, I'm white or black. It's because I would be carrying a weapon. Now, it turns out I actually don't carry concealed for a lot of reasons. I have a permit to do it. I actually don't do it. But if I did do it, that's how I would have to handle a traffic stop.
Yeah, and I think that would be a rational way to do it. It's a difficult problem. I have a lot of I talk to the police unions here, talk to the police officers a lot. They feel helpless. Like you said, you've got here in Houston, you've got a very diverse police force, and they're being yelled at by people and called racist, and these are black cops, and I don't. It's hard to know what's going through their heads at this time. Also, we've been somewhat fortunate. There was some violence in Houston, but it wasn't not like many of the other cities, and that's been a bright spot for our city at least.
I know I cut you off and you were trying to change the subject. I brought you back to policing again. So you want to change the subject?
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask you about academia and your experience there. Again, you've touched on it a little bit, and this sort of movement away from liberalism and academia as a place of free speech and free thought and challenging thought to a place where that's not okay at all. And you teach law, and law students are overwhelmingly to the left. But what is that environment like? What is it like being a libertarian? I also wanted to ask you about how you viewed the differences between conservatives and libertarians. But what is it like holding those views there? Do you see any improvements over the last few years as far as I don't know, student openness to different ideas, or is it getting worse? Are we getting better? And what's going on?
It's sort of a mixed bag. There are very, very few conservative or libertarians on any given law faculty. At Georgetown, we have a tenure track group of about 225 law professors, and there are 4 identifiably right of center professors on that faculty, and that makes us more diverse than most top elite law schools are, who barely have one, if not all. Harvard does it well, without going into particular names. But on the other hand, in absolute numbers, not relative numbers, in absolute numbers, there's a few more of us. But many of us are getting older. We got in when things were a little better, and I'm very fearful about the way things are going at the moment. First of all, the anti-free speech, deplatforming cancel culture was late coming to law schools. It was in undergraduate. When you saw those videos on campus, it was all stuff that was happening in liberal arts colleges. Mm-hmm. It was not happening in law schools. It started happening in law schools now. We even had the first incidents of deplatforming at Georgetown Law in the fall with McElhaney, the DHS secretary, whatever his name is, coming to Georgetown and got shouted off the stage. It's the first time any speaker in the United States has been shouted off the stage of a law school for this reason.
Oh, Georgetown got that, huh? Georgetown got that award?
Yep.
Congratulations.
I'm on the Free Speech and Expression Committee that's supposed to be drafting policies to condemn this in the future. But, I've met with students, we've met with students, and we've met with faculty, we've met with staff, and, we're getting pushback, and including internal to the committee itself, on free speech and what free speech matters and who gets to speak and who doesn't get to speak. So I think things are going downhill. You asked me earlier on, you alluded to how do I get by? How do I exist? Well, I've always had a very good life. The discrimination against me has always been on hiring. But once I get hired at a place, I'm treated very well by the people that are there because, they got past it. They didn't discriminate against me. They actually gave me a job. And I got always treated very well and respectfully by my colleagues, including my colleagues at Georgetown. I have no bad experiences. But I think there's been an upward pressure from the students, encouraged by a very small number of faculty members, but basically by the students themselves, and this left-wing attitude that has infected the undergraduate curriculum is now coming to the law schools. And I actually have a concern about saying the wrong thing one time, and that'll be my job.
Yeah.
Saying the one thing, all you have to do is make one mistake, and then your job is over. So
hopefully it's not this podcast that sinks you.
I have tenure, and so it's a little harder to get at me. But there's all kinds of ways to make my life miserable without literally firing me. And I know that's true, and I have heard, I've seen this, I've spoken with the students, and I see what their attitudes are, and I think they would cancel me if they could. I just have to not give them any excuse to do so. And, and I hate thinking like that because I've never had to think like that before. This is new. It's disturbing.
It is insane. How is it that students going to law school can have such radically different interpretations of the Constitution? I mean, you teach constitutional law. So what are some of the most interesting debates that you might have in class, and like how people are reading the Constitution and I guess how to fit their political philosophy?
Well, the way I teach constitutional law, I have always taught constitutional law. This doesn't really arise very much. So I don't have much experience with that. The way other people teach constitutional law is they'll say, okay, here's an issue, gay marriage or abortion or gun rights or something. And then they'll say, okay, how many people who are on this side will argue the best constitutional arguments for that side, and on the other side, you'll argue the best constitutional arguments for that side, and hopefully you'll have some kind of debate go on. I don't teach constitutional law like that at all. What I teach is the history of how our constitutional law has evolved from the founding until today. Not how the Constitution has evolved, because I'm not a living constitutionalist, but how constitutional law that's made by the Supreme Court has evolved. And so I'm basically teaching a descriptive course about all the key canonical cases that have ever been decided and all the evil anti-canonical cases that have been decided. And I put those into, my casebook puts those into historical context. And then I just try to explain to the students why we have the law we have. That leads to very few ideological discussions because, first of all, I'm an equal opportunity criticizer. I criticize both sides of the court. By the way, if those in the audience want to get my approach to constitutional law, they don't have to go to Georgetown Law. All they have to do is buy my book, An Introduction to Constitutional Law, 100 Supreme Court Cases Everyone Should Know, which costs like around $23 on Amazon. And when you buy that book, you get a scratch-off code on the inside cover to a series of 63 videos that my co-author, Josh Blackman, and I took 2 years to make and spent $100,000 to make, in which we go on screen in 5 to 15-minute segments and explain to you the history of constitutional law from the founding until today. And you can get my whole spiel in 11 hours if you binge watch the videos that you get if you buy that book.
Videos are a great way to absorb that kind of information. But nevertheless, there's still vast differences in how we interpret the Constitution. And I'm trying to figure out where it comes from. Sometimes I'm just perplexed because everybody claims to be protecting the Constitution, right? I mean, when Democrats were impeaching Trump and every time they criticize Trump, they claim they're protecting the Constitution. I don't know exactly what they're talking about. But we just seem to have, I view the Constitution as a document that tells us how to govern. I view the Declaration of Independence as a document that tells us why we govern. And there's maybe some wiggle room for interpretation, but not a whole lot. And I wonder if it's, when I look at Article 2 and there's the line that talks about the providing for the general welfare, is that's what's getting used when we talk about basically providing endless amounts of services and literal welfare, which is generally the Democrat platform, and involving government in more and more of your life. Is that what they're basing it on? Are they basing it on anything, or is it just because that's the easiest thing to campaign on? It's a drive for power. Is it all of the above, or do they even go that deep into the legal reasoning?
Well, I hate to cop out here, but I think that after an hour and 25 minutes, this is too big a topic to deal with.
For the next one, huh?
I think we should just set aside time and do a separate podcast just on this because it's complicated. The story is complicated, and there's blame to go around on both sides. So I spend almost as much of my time, criticizing political conservatives for some of their views on the Constitution as I do political progressives, in large part because many political conservatives have bought into the post-New Deal progressive constitutionalism that was on offer during the New Deal, and they basically are better New Dealers than the left is nowadays. But be this as it may, even what I just said suggests to you that this is too complicated to talk about in 5 minutes.
Fair enough. That keeps the audience hungry for more, and you've now committed to a second podcast where we dive into that, because we didn't even get into your views on libertarianism versus conservatism and how to talk about that. So that would make a great second podcast, and I think it would relate quite well because there was we got into a lot, and I think we all learned a lot on the legality of lockdowns, the issues that we've seen over the past week. And a lot more. So, hey, we appreciate you, and Professor, that was really great. Any parting words?
Yeah, I just want to thank you for your service to your country, and it's great to see people like you in Congress. You're not the only person in Congress that's a great guy, a great person who I've gotten to know since I've been at Georgetown. And anytime you want me back, Dan, I'm delighted to be back.
Well, that'd be great. And maybe next time we'll get you in D.C. When the apocalypse ends. So, although you look around, I think everybody's pretty much over it at this point. I don't know how Virginia is right now, but Houston is. We've been pretty much open since May 1st. So, we're ready to get back to normalcy, and it'd be great to actually see you in the office.
Well, I can tell you that both in the motorcycle dealership and where I went to get some parts, and in the gun stores, the people that are working in those stores are not wearing masks.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Something about those two. They're wearing masks in the grocery store, but in the gun stores and in the motorcycle dealerships and the jet ski dealerships, they're going mask free already.
Yeah, I mean, people are over it, and the type of people who own a gun store tend to be hyper liberty minded and also, I think, risk accepting. There's been a lot of interesting, I think, psychological observations on how people react to risk and authoritarian tendencies, and I wrote about this in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago. I think it was a great op-ed, but I don't know what everybody else thinks. But trying to dissect the difference in thinking, and I think people are ready to confront risk and get back to normalcy, and they believe that they can be trusted to do that, which I think it's government's role to simply give them the guidelines and trust people to live with freedom. That's kind of the whole point of America. But I hope we get back to that soon.
It says it in that it says it in the declaration that you just said is what we're supposed to be aiming towards.
It is. Well,